Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back at the Yerevan Dialogue again this year and have this audience in front of us. We have the subject climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecology, economy. Actually, if you start looking at it, climate change, maintaining biodiversity, and continuing to grow. It's these three things, and all three of them have a deep tension between them. Ordinarily, it would be thought that climate change, protecting climate change and the environment would be part of the same bag of tricks, but they're not. There are tensions between them too. So you have a typical three-body problem where these three things are pulling in very, very different directions. And our panel has a very difficult task of trying to sort out some of the tensions which prevail in this area. We have a great panel today. First of all, there's Pedro Francesco Delotto, President, Consultative Commission on Industrial Change of the European Economic and Social Committee. They are burdened with the task of shaping industrial policy, agricultural policy, the way forward. So you're going to have some really tough questions to answer, Pedro. Tamara Lagrashvili, Director, Central and Eastern Europe, Clean Air Task Force. Then we have Irina Gapelnian, Senior Climate Change Specialist, the World Bank Group, Armenia. And last but not the least, Alice Eponnet, Senior Advisor to the Operations Director, Agence Française de Développement, France. So time is short. We will straight away plunge into the questions. See, all of you would agree that this is no longer the world that came together to agree to the Paris Accord 10 years ago. A lot of things have shifted since then. The Paris Accord, in fact, seems to have been written for another age in a different time. And paradoxically, when the whole question of sustainability began in the 1980s with the Brundtland Report, and the sustainability discourse came into discussions, the question of ecology, environment, climate, economy, these questions were supposed to be third world problems. They were not supposed to be first world problems. In the 21st century, the whole game has shifted. And geopolitics, the way geopolitics has moved, the way trade has moved, trade wars have moved, those third world problems have also become first world problems. And the whole questions which are rising out of these debates equally afflict everyone in the world equally, and there is even less and less desire to work together on this. So these are the central tensions which we are facing. Now, the European Green Deal, which was aimed at making the Eurobloc carbon neutral by 2050, has seen massive resistance from stakeholders. Farmers have come out in the streets in Paris and all kinds of European capitals. They have been protesting. They're unhappy with the implementation of GEC standards. These were all third world problems. These were not first world problems. Then you have issues related to crop rotation, whether there's no agreement, and there's a lot of resistance on the regulations which have come up in place. In many ways, they remind us of the farmer-herder conflicts which used to arise in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa. So ecology, yes, has become an issue right across the world. So Pedro, I'll start with you. First of all, what strategies or innovations can help balance economic interests with environmental resilience? That is a big question. I'm asking this question also because there seems to be a conflict between the imperatives of preserving Europe's economic competitiveness and meeting biodiversity goals, a straight conflict. And you, as president of the ESC's industrial change body, you know the kind of pushback you had against the water resilience initiative, which you fathered in many ways, which you headed. And things have had to be pushed back, have had to be pulled back. So that is a central question which I'm asking you. How does the EU navigate these tensions to bring agriculture and industry together on the same page to move forward, or it's not going to move forward?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me thank the organizers for having me here in this beloved country. I love this country. It's not the first time. I've been here several times and always enjoying also this amazing, inspiring event. I'm so grateful for your easy question. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. But let me say a few things, from a general point of view. In Europe, we had a wave where, with the Green Deal, the environmental approach, facing the global climate change, sustainability, and not just from an environmental point of view, but also from a social point of view, was at the core. We realized in few years that we need to combine sustainability and competitiveness in all sectors. Competitiveness, it means not experiencing any closure of any agriculture company, any industrial company, any other actor affected by this process. But because we need to be, I belong to the business community, and I know that I belong from this one, and I need to, by contract, to be pragmatic. But by mission, we need to be visionary. As part of the policy making in Europe, we thought that all the packages we created, the Zero Pollution Act, the Clean Industrial Deal, and now, thank you for recalling, I'm very proud because we launched the EU Blue Deal, a comprehensive policy for water in Europe, bringing to the water resilience strategy, we thought to have an holistic approach, not just a partial and specifically and from an environmental point of view approach. An holistic approach, it means how to combine businesses, employees, environmentalists, consumers, policymakers at the same level in order to achieve this result. This is the question, how to create in thinking in a very completely different way, thinking out of the box, new instruments, new tools, new approaches to be more resilient, more sustainable, but at the same time, absolutely more competitive. The clean tech value chain is a clear example on that. We can be competitive and allow me to say, and I conclude this first round by saying it's not a constraint. It's an amazing opportunity to be more sustainable. As businesses, in water, adopting in agriculture a more water efficient system. Industries. In industries, we can incentivize them to adopt new technologies, to be more water recycling, water saving, and as consumers, as citizens. We can do. It's possible, but we need to adopt a completely different approach, a really comprehensive and adopting an holistic perspective.
Thank you, Pietro. I'll come back to you on the question of resilience later, but let me now move on to Tamara. Tamara, I'd like you to look at the problem from the more regional lens, because look at from the perspective of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And yesterday at that excellent panel we had, on the question of climate change and the issues about green transitions, we heard how geopolitical fragmentation is pitting clean energy transition against challenges to countries' growth and security. The question of competitiveness, which Pietro just mentioned, there are large issues there. And much of this resistance is not just denial, it's not coming from the climate denial side. the climate change denial people. Much of it is to do with a question of livelihoods, a fear of job losses, or what is going to happen to certain sectors of the industry which have been the pillars of economic growth in many, many cases. So in such a situation, naturally, are governments in Central and Eastern Europe cautious about the Green Deal and where this is headed?
Thank you very much. And thanks to the Armenian government, as Georgian, I am so grateful for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Armenia and the whole government for putting this very important region really on the spotlight, because this has been like the long overdue of really having conversation about the South Caucasus role in the bigger energy growth and transition conversation. A little bit of reflection to your earlier question about the first world versus second world problems. I think because everything is just so intertwined, there is more of the question how the developed world is enabling rather than streamlining the post-colonial strategies in the developing world. So when we have the foreign direct investment, and when we have the different kind of aids going into the developing world, how does it empowers actually the local communities rather than it creates benefits for the donors themselves? And I think just very quickly, for instance, in Africa, there are like 900 million people without access to clean cooking and 600 million without clean electricity. So these are all in this very fragmented world. I think that we need to think more about kind of the synergies, especially when the traditional allies are shifting away, and understanding how Europe actually can play a more of a leader role in forging those international partnerships that benefits to the developing world as well as it benefits Europe. Quickly about industry, I think it has been already mentioned quite nicely how in the phase of the Ukraine's ongoing, Russia's ongoing war, there has been a huge shift about the energy transition, where the clean energy supply should have been coming from. And I think that industry has been the primary victim with the skyrocketing energy prices. Obviously, the industry has been bleeding in Central and Eastern Europe, but also Germany, for instance, as the powerhouse of the European Union. And there has been a lot of initiatives like Clean Industrial Deal, Action Plan for Affordable Energy. And I would like to mention two things. One is the importance of the clean fuels, because this is going to be the cornerstone of industrial transformation. And just to put everything into the perspective, because when we talk about, for instance, the biofuels or sustainable aviation fuels, so-called SAF, European Union has very clear targets, for instance, on SAF that we want to have 6% already in 2030 and some 70% in 2050. And we have to think, what does it mean for the equality? Aviation is one of the most unequal pieces of the industry. We still have 80% of the world population who is not able to travel. So understanding through the mechanism how it becomes more equitable is very important. But also let's think about through the land systems. Having these very high targets on the biofuels or the sustainable aviation fuels has a lot of impact on the lands and agricultural lands, right? Currently, Europe consumes some 1.6 million barrels per day of jet fuels. Now, to transform these into clean fuels by whatever dates, this will require 500 million of hectares of land. This is far more than Europe's arable land. So if you look and think about the grant system and systems perspective about land, this is kind of impossible, right? Without jeopardizing some other competing needs for the land use, agriculture, clean infrastructure deployment, and so on. So this needs to be taken into account. And the second one is obviously hard to abate industries, right? Which are not so hard to abate anymore because of the electrification. But there's going to be a huge, huge need for technologies like carbon capture and storage, which is basically capturing the CO2 at the source point and then is compressing and storing it in the geological formations. Why I'm saying that? Because all this is going to shape Europe's future and also its international partnerships. When we talk about zero carbon fuels, a lot of times we have the palm trees that are basically transforming the sunlight into the oil, and most of them is coming from Malaysia and the Southeast Asian countries. So understanding the sustainability and biodiversity and what our targets mean for the developing world is incredibly important. And the last bit about the Central and Eastern Europe, obviously this is an increasingly important part of Europe, kind of the new joiners. They have celebrated 20 years of accession, but still the new joiners compared to the rest of Europe. The limited fiscal space, the aging infrastructure, limited interconnectivity in terms of transmission lines, limited workforce, the Soviet legacy in terms of industrial dependence is still there. So the countries in the region really have a Herculean task, especially in the lens of just transition, understanding how we can decarbonize, but also how we can make sure that this transition is equitable for coal workers, but also for the heavy industry that is present in the region. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Put your finger on the question of biodiversity and different approaches to biodiversity. And this is the right point to bring Irina into the debate. Irina, you are part of the World Bank. Now, how do you handle the economics of biodiversity and natural capital into country-level strategies when we start looking at the national level? Now, how is it possible to integrate these? And then the second part of this is then how do small countries, we've talked about large countries, Central Europe, East Europe, but how do small countries like Armenia handle and navigate these challenges?
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and it's a pleasure to be at such a distinguished panel. And of course, words of gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Armenia for organizing this important dialogue and seconding my fellow panelists here, Tamara. I think it's long overdue to have focus on this important region, important from the perspective of connectivity, important from the perspective of biodiversity. And bear with me as I make my point stronger with some of the arguments that I'll bring forward today. So, as most of you know, the World Bank is one of the largest international financial institutions, and we're known as the lending arm of the United Nations body. But we're also a knowledge bank. If you look at the amount of knowledge products that we deliver globally to our clients, it's really another big hat that we carry proudly. So a lot of analytics goes into understanding how we can most effectively lend to our clients so every dollar goes a long way. And increasingly, we have done a lot of retrospection as well, trying to understand who we are as an institution, because 80 years ago when the World Bank was founded, our main mandate was ending poverty. It continues to be as such. But as we have retrospectively analyzed how we lend and how effectively we lend to the clients, we also realized that to make developmental gains count as we lend money to our clients, we need to take one very important aspect into consideration, and that's the environment. The natural capital gives us services that amount, according to World Bank analytics, to $125 trillion annually. That's a big price tag to ignore. So as a result of this retrospection, what we did is we redefined our mandate. Today, the World Bank is known not only as an institution that fights poverty, the World Bank is also known as an institution that fights poverty on a livable planet. Because if we do not factor in the environmental sustainability, the developmental gains will be very marginal. So with that, we have been working with our clients on developing important analytical database and knowledge products based on which we make these decisions. Because today, unfortunately, as we see the economic and industrial models are still externalizing the environmental costs. And we have to work very hard and at accelerated pace in order to be able to factor in these important aspects, because as I mentioned, nature gives us services that amount to 125 trillion annually. That's a big amount of money that we cannot ignore. Now, bringing it to the analytics that we provide for all of our clients, including small countries like Armenia, we provide this major knowledge product, a flagship report, which is called CCDR. It stands for Country Climate and Development Report, where we look at the projections of how we can pair the developmental goals and climate considerations, ensuring that we capitalize on developmental goals, taking into consideration that the planet is warming, taking into consideration that for small countries like Armenia, mitigation and adaptation are equally important, if not more important on the adaptation side, because if we take Armenia, for example, Armenia's emissions in the global inventory constitute only 0.02%. Right, so when we talk to the Armenian government and try to convince to mitigate, although that argument is easy to make as well, because it's in Armenia's national interest to transition to renewables to make their energy independence more stable. So with that, let me respond also to the second part of the question on the biodiversity and why it's important for small countries. We've done a seminal report which is called The Changing Wealth of Nations in 2021, and it showed that in specifically developing countries, low-income countries, nature accounts for 1/3 of the nation's wealth. And in case of Armenia, it's certainly not an exception. You know, when you come to a Caucasus region, the last thing you think is biodiversity. But in fact, Georgia, Armenia, neighboring Turkey, Iran, all of these countries are in what's called a biodiversity hotspot. There are only 36 of these hotspots globally, and we're in one of them. We're sharing the Caucasian and Irano-Anatolian plateau. A small country of Armenia has 4 climatic zones that contributes to high density of biodiversity, both flora and fauna. So here you will find an exceptional wealth, natural wealth that we need to capitalize on. And it's not surprising that this country is hosting Biodiversity Conference of Parties next year. Now, why this is important for small and developing countries? Well, as I said, because nature accounts for a significant portion of our wealth. In case of Armenia, Georgia, and other neighboring countries, sustainability of our natural resources is critical for us to continue developing. For example, tourism is one significant sector where we need to ensure that sustainability is factoring because nature-based tourism is growing, and the countries in our region can offer significant destinations in terms of bird watching. You know, the other day we were doing another discussion, and I had a presentation, and one of the photos that I brought forward was photos of flamingos, and people in the audience didn't believe me that flamingos actually fly into our region. They stop over, they eat. We have great food, as you probably have already witnessed yourselves. So yeah, it's a connectivity hotspot, not only biodiversity hotspot, and also building on the earlier comment that Deputy Minister said about opening connectivity. Serendipitously, Armenia and the Caucasus region is also on these incredible crossroads of biodiversity. And I think next year it will be a seminal year for the dialogue, global dialogue on biodiversity, because where we stood on climate dialogue pre-Paris Agreement in 2015, we're standing at that precipice today on biodiversity dialogue, because we need to agree on financing. The financing needs for biodiversity are upwards of 700 billion annually. For climate, it's 1.3 billion. And we need to have quantifiable goals. And I certainly hope that not only Armenian government, but governments that support this important agenda will throw in their resources to ensure that we are able to negotiate ahead of COP17 and agree on these important aspects. Thank you.
Lise, I think Irina has given you the perfect opening with those closing statements, the issue of finance. And I'd like you to look at all the 3 pillars of this finance issue: climate finance, biodiversity finance, and development finance. And I'd begun by saying that there are tensions between all 3 of them. And these streams many times do not flow together. many times they're bottlenecks, many times they become adversarial to each other. And on top of it all, we are talking 10 years after the Paris Agreement, where the whole question of finance, including climate finance, has become hostage to geopolitics. Soon after the inauguration of President Trump, not even after his inauguration, before the inauguration of President Trump, in fact, from in December itself, before he'd even taken oath of office, you saw major financial institutions in the US and Canada actually opt out of a lot of alliances like the Climate Action Network, Net Zero Banking Alliance, and so on and so forth. And then corporates started following in their wake. So, first of all, have climate and biodiversity finance become hostage to geopolitical ambitions?
How climate finance is a node stage of geopolitics? It's not an easy question, but I guess it's the elephant in the room we need to address, because as you said, 10 years after the Paris Agreement, I think we live now in a very different world, especially on the international relations stage. And I think that in 2015, we reached a consensus that we thought was actually made and not questioned. And we thought at the time that not we made it, because obviously we need to acknowledge the fact that the financial gap was still here. But at the time we thought that financing climate change will not, the fight against climate change will not be questioned. And right now it is. It is because we have many major actors that are withdrawing, as you said, from this fight, this universal fight. And I guess that here we need to make maybe 2 points to understand what is the geopolitization of climate finance. First, I think that climate finance is questioned because in 2015 it was addressed under the universalist approach and the functionalist approach, the fact that it was universal topic and a technicist topic that was made. Right now, we are living in a world where transactionalist approach, interest approach are actually the main issues, and we are beginning to address the return of the real politic. And I guess here that some actors are trying to create an opposition between the fight against climate change and interest, which is something to me that is not relevant for the reason that, as in the panel you said, this is about human security and this is about common interest. And solidarity is not a word that should be withdrawn from the geopolitical stage. And when we talk about the human security related to climate change and to biodiversity loss, we're talking about 3.5 billion people if we take the IPCC report, and 4.5 billion people if we take the World Bank report that was released last year. So what can we do? Because the geopolitization of climate finance has actually real impact on the financial gap that we are addressing in our field. There is 2 results of this geopolitization. The first is the fragmentation of the finance, because we have many actors that are providing finance, and I would say smaller tickets, average tickets that are given, while we need to coordinate and actually to leverage more finance together. And when I say together, it's of course development finance, public finance, private finance. We can't do it alone. And I think that, as Samir said earlier, this is also community and bank issues. And what we tried to do at AFD is actually to create a coalition of public development banks. We gathered more than 500 banks and IFIs in order to address this fragmentation topic, and also to address the methodology topic of climate finance and biodiversity loss. Because what we see is that when we talk about this topic and we work in various countries, we have taxonomy issues, because some countries actually do not work with the same taxonomy. And the international organization here are trying to bridge that gap. For example, in India, we worked with Climate Bond Initiative, and we created a taxonomy in the meantime to help the finance provider target the project that could help leverage more finance for adaptation and for biodiversity loss. And I think these coalitions are not another framework or another dialogue that will bring more conversation. This is key here to fight this geopolitization and the externalities that it brings. Because, as we said, this is a solidarity issue. This is a universalist approach. Even if we need to have more transactionalist method, we need to address this geopolitics changes in our field.
So I'll start the second round from the other side. Alisa, I'll take up where you left off. How do you feel now as part of the agency AFD, and you're handling the issues of finance? How do you feel, you talked about coalitions of finance, coalitions of banks. Are you optimistic about them? What has been your experience looking at the present? Are they coming together, or are there challenges there?
I think we really come together. The Finance in Common Summit is happening for the 6th year in a row. It started actually before COVID, and we really came together in order to learn from each other on the methodology approach and also to co-finance projects together. Because I'm talking from a donor's perspective, but I think we should also take it from the counterpart's perspective and our partner's perspective, because if we fragment our finance, it's even more difficult for small countries, for example, to integrate and implement the finance that is provided. I'm working, for example, in the 6 countries like Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, and they tell us all the time that we need to coordinate beforehand. Because when we come and talk to the Ministry of Climate Finance and they have so many things to do and they are facing HR issues, it's our duty and our responsibility actually to work beforehand to provide this finance accordingly. So this is something that we do. And also we launched a platform on a national basis that is called the Greening the Financial System. And in this platform, we do partner with donors, but also with private actors, such as insurance, pension funds, banks, public and private banks, in order to work on methodology and again to target the project that could be relevant for the adaptation strategies of the countries. And also we do work with the banks in order to green their strategy and to help them assessing also the risk that they have on their portfolio. Because one trigger that we can have here, it's the economic one. If we talk to the banks and we say that actually you have transition risk regarding climate change, then it can also allow us to start another conversation that could multiply and also improve the way we implement adaptation finance and biodiversity laws.
Irina, from your experience, and just sticking to the same question, from your experience in the World Bank, what are the instruments? Are there innovative instruments that are being thought of, which can give this push forward from apex bodies, the multilateral development institutions? Is there a future for blended finance? Where are we headed?
Thank you. Look, let me divide my answer into 2 parts, because I think whereas there are definitely innovations as we're moving forward and progressing as a society, there's also age-old knowledge that we need to revisit as we're trying to face the challenges of biodiversity loss and warming of the planet. So on the innovation side, absolutely. In terms of financing, the World Bank authored 2 seminal pieces last year on debt for development swaps. It's common knowledge throughout the developing world that the fiscal space is very constrained in countries across the global south. It's not only across Africa and Asia, but also in Eastern Europe, in our part of the world. So how do we make that fiscal space to invest into critical aspects of conservation and climate mitigation and adaptation? And one of the solutions and innovative keys is debt for development swaps. Now, this innovation has been in place for quite some time. As we know, we do have delegates also from Seychelles here, and Seychelles have been one of those countries that had undertaken debt for environment swap. But debt for climate swap is looking at more targeted, more focused, more tailored swaps, bilateral swaps with of public debt between countries. And what is the positive aspect in this is that it's a win-win scenario. On the one hand, the country that has a constrained fiscal space is able to mobilize climate finance or mitigation, adaptation, resilience finance for the projects that it needs to invest in. And on the other hand, the country that's lending or re-lending the money or forgiving the credit against the swap is meeting its own NDC commitments, the commitments under its nationally determined contributions with the Paris Agreement. So in that respect, it's a win-win scenario, and a number of countries are now looking into, more importantly, countries like Germany has committed on the state level, on the government level, to unlock this very important key or solutions, and they have started these debt for climate swaps with a number of countries in North Africa. Now, on the age-old knowledge, sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to look back at how we did it before. And for example, among the knowledge products that I mentioned that the World Bank provides to its clients is the Country Climate and Development Report. As part of these reports, we also look into landscape restoration opportunities. And when we did this assessment for Armenia, there are so many very low-cost interventions that Armenia can do to capitalize on its investments, to capitalize on the return on investment, whether we're talking about croplands, grazed lands, grasslands, forest lands, and of course wetlands. And the ratio that we received was 1:4. For example, for croplands, we received 1:6. That is, the return on investment is 1:6, for example, in croplands. Why? Because countries like Armenia with very, let me call it, bad legacy of unsustainable Soviet agricultural practices needs to tweak it a little bit and, for example, adopt crop rotation, widely adopt drip irrigation. All of these low-cost interventions can result in significant gains, and according to our calculations with croplands, it's 1:6, sorry. With forest lands, it's 1:4. So these are the age-old things that we can, again, invest in without necessarily reinventing. So in summary, I think as we look forward to more innovation in financing, in finding that money which is there, but figuring out the mechanisms to unlock these for conservation and prevention of biodiversity laws and resilience, investing in resilience. At the same time, we need to look into what we have done before that worked and do it at scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Tamara, I'll stick on the subject of what Irina mentioned, which is constrained fiscal space. And again, looking at Central Europe, Eastern Europe perspective, yes, there's a constrained fiscal space. Then when you start looking at the various instruments available, from carbon pricing, and renewable subsidies to coal phase-out programs, the various policy tools which can drive a clean energy transition. But each comes with trade-offs. There are political costs to it, there are economic trade-offs. Now, in your view, which policy instruments, from your perspective, have been most effective and can be most effective in driving the energy transition forward?
Thank you very much. I think several points to mention, kind of to start at high level. I think in Europe, we used to have this kind of feeling, especially when in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act came out. This like the fundamental piece which was giving a lot of tax credits and production tax credits as well to the clean technologies, and is now under jeopardy in the new administration that, oh my God, they are just having so much more money than we do. And we did a lot of calculation at my organization, and we saw that in grand scheme of things, it's not really the case. Europe does have money. It's really about understanding how the different funding schemes, you have the Modernization Fund, Cohesion Fund, Recovery and Resilience, Innovation Fund, and so on. So understanding, which I think member states, especially with limited public administration, find it very difficult to navigate, but also sometimes the way they are designed is not necessarily helping the clean techs to get from the R&D to the demonstration to the full commercialization. So understanding how those schemes are stacking up each other to make sure that when there is R&D and there's a lot of patents happening in Europe, they does not get then outside because of the lack of clarity what is the next level of the funding streams is incredibly important. Of course, now the big challenge in the face of this new geopolitical reality where US is threatening to withdraw from NATO and basically is leaving Europe to defend for itself. We have now the multi-annual financial framework negotiations starting in July. So there's going to be a lot of competing demands on the defense and the climate. So while the people on the panel and in the room might not want to see the climate backsliding, there will be some compromise and trade-offs because, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, because we have Russia next to us, so physical security is the main kind of the driver of all the conversations going forward. Now, when it comes to the limited fiscal space, as the non-profit organization, we are advising the government to look at not a single project bankability, but really at systemic bankability, because especially in the Central and Eastern Europe, the level and the scope of the transition that really requires scaling up and going to this end kind of the deployment in a very limited amount of time. So we are really looking and also encouraging the policymakers in the region to look at the systems level rather than the isolated, right? So for instance, we're always encouraging them to look at these 6 conventional risks that every clean energy developer is looking at, right? It's like the financial regulation risk, the policy risk, infrastructure risk, revenue risk, commercialization risk, reputational risk, and understanding where does this clean technology, the given one, is really standing. Does it have the revenue source? Where does, on the technology readiness level, does it stand? What is the public perception look like? Is there enough workforce to deliver on the clean project, etc.? And then, of course, another very important piece for any kind of climate or biodiversity project is understanding who will chip in. We know very well that there's a limited sovereign fiscal space, so private capital has to come in. However, also understanding where on the investor side, what is their ticket size? What is their risk appetite? What is their repayment appetite is very important, right? So we know, for instance, venture capitals, they have high risk profile, but they are also having limited ticket size compared to the institutional investors, like, for instance, hedge funds or the pension funds or others who have like more patience, but obviously are more risk averse. So understanding that a bit of systems perspective, which sometimes policymakers don't have, really helps them understanding what are the trade-offs and how they can utilize the limited money they have at their disposal in a most pragmatic way.
Pedro, my last question to you. Everyone's mentioned resilience. You also mentioned resilience. My question is that there are costs to resilience. That is one problem. Second problem is that in a situation where each country is thinking for itself, each nation thinks for itself, one country's efforts at resilience militate and actually become another country's risks. For example, the IRA is an instrument which attracts investments, which may attract finance from certain areas and suck them out from certain other countries. So, what in the larger policy framework of the EU, what is being thought about on some of these issues?
Thank you so much for this really crucial question, because we are experiencing in Europe a moment where it seems that alone we can do something, not all, but something. I think is totally misleading. Not wrong, but misleading. All these processes, sustainability, I would say competitiveness, mobilizing in an appropriate way capitals that are not in our pockets. We have not enough money to do everything. Also in Europe, the most, I would say, comparable to US. In Europe, we have savings, profits, but not in our pockets. This is one of the results of the huge mistake we did some 2 decades ago, when we missed to create the financial and banking system, European banking system, and we cannot maintain since then our savings and profits, a huge amount of money we create every day in Europe, mobilizing in an appropriate way. But you are right. When we have global challenges, just in jointly we could face and we could act in an appropriate and effective way. Sometimes we are thinking that some larger European countries could manage these processes alone, but it's not the case. It's not the case in infrastructure, it's not the case in defense, it's not the case in sustainability transition, it's not the case when we have to pay, not the price, but the cost of the adjustment in the short and maybe in the midterm. The cost of the adjustment could be managed, can be managed, if we adopt appropriate policy and appropriate measures at continental level, I would say, in order to have a more competitive companies and more sustainable companies. A better way to face new challenges we have. You mentioned, of course, this is the core of our discussion, the global climate change. Water, for example, the water issue we are experiencing, and not just in Southern Europe. Across Europe, we have the water issue everywhere, from Poland to Cyprus, from Spain and Portugal to Poland, everywhere. But if we have to think how to finance in a different way infrastructure solutions, we need to mobilize billions of euros in a different way. But we have to think that we have to be effective, not efficient. Because we have to remember also that we have roughly 10 million of Europeans not allowed to access to clean water in Europe in 2025. In 2025, we have some developed regions losing up to 60% of their water, clean water, from the system. So all these kind of challenges needed to be managed jointly, all together. Alone, we could be perceived doing something, but totally not effective, not efficient, and not, I would say, wise enough for that.
Well, I was hoping to actually leave some time for audience questions, but we are running out of time. So instead of asking the audience to raise questions, I'll just raise one question for the audience and ask them to respond yes or no to it. And the question is very simple. Just raise your hands if you say yes to it, keep it down if you say no to it, okay? Now, listening to all the panelists which we have had, now is the larger question which we actually need to talk about maybe next year is our current agro-industrial model really compatible with ecological sustainability, or is a deeper rethink required of how we are headed and what we are going to do? Do you agree with that or you don't agree with that? Those who agree can raise their hands. How many think the current model is absolutely right? So it seems the consensus is that the way forward is with what we have. So thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for having been part of this discussion. I really enjoyed having this conversation. You people were brilliant. Please join me in giving them a big hand. I would not have been able to answer these questions.